Welcome to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth, and we're here to preserve and promote culture, one weekly conversation at a time. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show through iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, Google Play, and a whole bunch of other venues. Just visit our sites, chimeraobscura.com/VM or vmspod.com to find more information, along with our RSS feed. And follow the show on Twitter and Instagram at VMSPod. Well, I am a week away from hosting my in-person pharma conference for the first time since 2019, and well, I'm pretty stressed over it. I'm actually on top of everything, near as I can tell. Catering, AV, posters, badges, conference guide, that's all off to the printer. The off-site restaurant is booked. There's no bus this time because it's a walk from the hotel. The presenters and panelists are all in place. Still, there's a bunch of stuff that could go wrong last minute, like the remote presenters and attendees on the Zoom connection, or weird COVID variant showing up really late and knocking everybody out. But I think I've done everything I could, so that's something. That said, I have already decided not to post a new episode next week. I have to leave for Maryland for the show late Monday morning to get there for setup and anxiety. So you can just imagine how much worse my anxiety would be if I'm also madly trying to get the episode artwork to load or post the website or figure out why the YouTube feed isn't showing up or something. So for the first time in over a year, because it was August of last year when I did this, I'm going to skip a week. Although, knowing me, I'll probably post 2 or 3 episodes the following week just to make up for it, because that's me. But anyway, I need to get this one posted before Yom Kippur, so let's get to the conversation. Now, my guest this week is W. David Marx, author of the wonderful new book, Status and Culture: How Our Desire for Social Rank Creates Taste, Identity, Art, Fashion, and Constant Change. It's published by Viking, came out a few weeks ago. It is a remarkable work. David's going to talk about his approach and his goals for the book early on in our talk, so I'm not going to recapitulate everything here. I will just say he manages, in a pretty brief volume, like 270 pages before the notes, to really explore what culture is, how it changes, and why some tastes and fashions don't catch on, and how the driver of all this is status in a, well, I'm oversimplifying David's argument in the book. He does a really great job of showing how certain types of behavior originate and proliferate, and what identity signals accompany them, and what the value of status really is, what social rank means. And again, he'll get at all this, so I'm going to gloss over it. I'll say his framework is really expansive. It can show micro and macro trends and how they develop in different fields, why we choose certain behaviors and not others, and what we're really looking for and at when we're in the world with others. And this covers more than the conventional definition of fashion. It's about lifestyle, aspiration, art, sense of self. There's a lot going on, a lot of things that he sort of helps understand, how we are defined and how we define each other. Plus, late in the book, it really gets at a key issue for me. David writes about the disruptions of the internet era and how a lot of the models and modes of cultural proliferation that have worked over centuries, if not millennia, are, we'll just say, disrupted by the internet. How certain social ranks have seemingly become less visible and therefore less potent, I guess, as status signs, while other modes of symbols of signaling have proliferated because they're more Instagrammable or otherwise, fit into different social media platforms. And there are other aspects of the internet that have changed our relationship in terms of status and what sort of statuses we get and are looking for. But it all gets at the big question of cultural progress and whether we're in a really static era right now, or whether we were in a really dynamic era previously, and this sort of era is what we're what historically, mankind is used to. And the book, really gets into these strong discussions of art, like real art, and the status and rank that accrues to great artists. And that all leads into my ongoing question throughout much of this show, and I mean the history of this show, which is whether great art is achievable in this day and age. And some of the press coverage of status and culture focused on that issue, the one of cultural stagnancy. It was media, so they were focused on the everything is good but nothing is great vibe. And David really works hard at exploring that and conveying whether it's true, and then, trying to understand the implications of it, if so. Anyway, Status and Culture is a remarkable book. It's one that's going to reframe how you see the world. Or it'll make you argue with it to the point at which you have to articulate and defend another vision of why we are the way we are and what culture is and how it changes. And if you can pull that off, that's a win too. Now, here's David's bio from the book. W. David Marx is a longtime writer on culture based in Tokyo and the author of Amatora, How Japan Saved American Style. His work has appeared in The New Yorker, Lapham's Quarterly, Popeye, The New Republic, and Vox. And now, the Virtual Memories conversation with W. David Marx. Where did the book begin for you, Status and Culture? And what I usually ask as a follow-up, how did it change from what you thought it was going to be?
So everybody engages with culture. A lot of people spend time thinking about pop culture, high culture, notice the behavior of the world. And this is something I've been obsessed with for a long time. And just assumed that the way economics has books that explain the principles of economics, or that science explains the laws of science, physics, gravity, things like that, there would be this book that existed out there that more or less explained what is happening with the culture around us in contemporary times. And you would assume that something like anthropology or sociology has put this together to explain, here are all the different kinds of cultural behavior going on in contemporary society, whether that means the creation of pop culture through big companies, the development of interesting new cultural behaviors within subcultures and countercultures, how wealthy people signal their wealth and position, and put these all together. And in graduate school, I had studied marketing and consumer behavior, and again, assumed that these books existed. And what I found was there was no single book that did this, but more than that, the way you were taught about these principles, because these cultural mechanics do exist to a certain degree, is you're taught that Thorstein Veblen said this about conspicuous consumption. And then Pierre Bourdieu said this about the way that aesthetics and social class are linked. But they're taught in silos, and there's nothing to work together to say they may be describing the same phenomenon. And so as I learned about those theories and something like the diffusion of innovation theory of Everett Rogers, which doesn't look that much at fashion. He has a little bit about fashion, but not so much. I started thinking, well, all these are telling the same story. And what would be great is to bring them all together instead of contrasting them or just describing the discipline, but to actually make a practical handbook for everyone to say, these are the principles that generally explain where culture comes from, why it changes, and what it means for each individual. And so for a long time, I had thought about how do you make a book that brings together all these things, weaves them all together, looks across disciplines, because you need to bring in things like economics and psychology and increasingly neuroscience to build one story of how culture works. And as I was doing this, there was two problems. First is that the word culture is incredibly ambiguous. It explains.
I was just going to ask, how did you actually define culture first?
But yeah. This was what was so hard about trying to do this book, was that I would explain to people, I want to write a book about how culture works. And they would say, oh, like the organizational norms within companies. It's like, oh, no, not that meaning of culture. It's like, oh, you mean high culture, like art and opera and ballet. Like, oh, no, I mean, you mean popular culture. Well, not quite only popular culture. And then there's also obviously the anthropological sense of culture, which is, the ways of being for tribal people, and then applying that to modern culture as well. So the word culture is so ambiguous that it became difficult to talk about it. I think that was one of the problems. And writing about that ambiguity is quite boring to a normal audience as well. So what happened over time is, as I was looking at how these mechanisms worked for where culture comes from and why it changes, I kept hitting the concept of status. And the anthropologist Grant McCracken had taken, I think in the 1980s, he wrote a book called Culture and Consumption, and he looked at Georg Zimmel's theory of fashion, about how it kind of goes from top down. And in Zimmel's day, and in the 19th century and before, fashion really did go from high status, as in wealthy people, down to, let's say, the middle class, down to the rest of the population. And he said you could reform this. You could still use this if you replace wealth with high status. So if you just look at status as the hierarchy, you could still have this top-down mechanism. And the more I looked at this, and the more I looked at what I was interested in, taste and subcultures, everything came back to status. And so over time, I realized the book was not just about culture; it was about status. And the problem with status is, until very recently, there have been very few books that just straight out try to explain what status is and where it comes from. And I think it was a pretty well used term in the field in the 1950s and 60s, and it's kind of dropped out since then and had a revival, I think, because a lot of the work in social psychology and people like Cameron Anderson, or in sociology, Cecilia Ridgway. But there wasn't just a book about status the way that there's a book about, capitalism, The Wealth of Nations, or socialism with Das Kapital and things like that. And so as I was looking into that, I had to kind of start building in my own model of, what status is doing on an individual level, and then how those take on macro effects. And at the end of the day, I realized that the book about culture I was writing was really a book about status and culture, and that's where it came from.
And at what point did you feel you were biting off way more than you could chew, or that you could still manage to do this in, I believe, 276 pages before notes and everything? It's so all-encompassing, and you managed to systematize, compress, and get everything across in ways that I was just astonished that you were able to sort of keep it under control like that. I guess, how much of a challenge was that to do? I mean, how much was it? You could go down this rabbit hole, and this one, and this one.
There were definitely rabbit holes that were cut, and, especially I have a chapter about art that feels a little bit distinct from the rest of the book. And I had all sorts of theories of the specific direction that artistic innovation goes because of the social structure that it's made in, and all that got cut. So there was definitely times in which I started cutting things. I think it was definitely one of those books where I had to write it first to understand what I was saying. And I got to the end of the first draft, probably with a couple months to spare before my deadline. And I went through and I said, what am I really saying? And it came down to, I'm talking about the influence of status seeking on individuals, and what are those macro effects in the culture. And that became three topics, which is, how does status affect the behavior of individuals? How do the status struggles of certain groups lead to the creation of new cultural forms? And then why does culture change, and why does culture stick based off of those same status principles? And then I applied all of that to thinking about how the internet has changed culture, which, that section I hoped to have been its own book. I originally was thinking about this as a 2-book series, where the first would explain what are the classical rules of how we understand status and culture, and the second would say, now we can apply it to the 21st century. But the book market demands that all those things put together. So, that once I had kind of that framework, it was very clear what goes in and what doesn't go in. And certainly there are things that I could have expounded upon more. There's probably entire sentences that could have been sections, but that's just the kind of book it is. I think we're in a nonfiction book market now where really you're supposed to have one single thesis and 300 pages double spaced of explaining that thesis over and over again in different ways. But this book is a synthesis. It's supposed to be meant as a handbook in a sense that, you can read it and you will understand all the principles of status and culture that affect both your individual lives and also the macro effects of those. And people have quibbles with it or, say, well, maybe that principle doesn't apply as much as I think it does. But, it's a start just to bring all this together in one book. And I hope that the corrections and the dissents and all that help strengthen the general ideas in there, because I was just frustrated for a long time that this was not available, that you could not just read one book and get all this information.
Yeah, in a sense, it reminded me of, and I'm dating myself and making myself a nerd on this one, Scott McCloud's book, Understanding Comics, which came out in the early 90s and really tried to bring a semiotics approach to what comics are and what they do and what happens between the panel, basically, what the human mind does to fill in that space. And a lot of people liked the book. A lot of people disagreed with it violently, but even in the disagreements, they had to start articulating their positions on these things in ways that no one was really doing before that book existed. So I hope you end up getting the same sort of either accolades or at least, people enumerating or defining issues beyond this. But when did you, I guess, decide that the random walk or virality weren't sufficient to explain culture and what becomes adopted into the culture? What point did you look at and say that just doesn't work? There has to be something else at play here.
So, I've been paying attention to this subject for, as long as I was engaged in culture. So, even at age 13 or 14, I was very much into alternative music in the 1990s. And you start noticing that the whole culture is built on this idea of rebellion. And yet all the kids who are into it are rebelling the same ways. And so this idea of, conformity within rebellion was very clear to me at a young age. I used to make fun of it quite a bit. I felt that I was not accepted in those circles because I, was conforming in different ways to mainstream values that they didn't agree with. And so, I thought about that for a long time. And then when I started going to Japan, because I had studied Japanese at university, started going to Japan. And what was quite interesting there was to see things that were very, very hip in the US or UK that were only known among a very small amount of people be mainstream culture, and people adopt it in a very conformist way. And so dealing with those contradictions also, I had started to look into the models of how fashion works. And once you understand how fashion works, and fashion is somewhat of still, it's a taboo, I think, within, academic circles. People think fashion is frivolous and a sort of negative part of life. But, so much of life can probably be explained through these fashion mechanics. And so when you look at some of the theories that were positive for cultural change, so let's say the random walk theory, which is just that culture goes in crazy directions and they're unpredictable, that didn't make very much sense, because if you look at the way fashion trends move, they move in a narrative, which is that, let's say you have fashion A, after a while, when that becomes too popular, the elite will move on to fashion B as a negation of A. And what that means is that when that becomes popular and they have to go to another fashion, they can't go back to A because A still exists in the population. They'll go to C and they'll move forward. At some point, when A disappears, it can come back as retro. But when you think about those mechanics, you realize it can't be random. You can't just go to a random letter. These next bits of innovation have to fit the narrative. They have to go in a different direction. So it is more structured than a random walk. And I knew that. And so knowing how status infects this process, I knew that taste was too structured to be random. I think with virality, it was one that made sense at first. And the viral theory is more or less that if I do some sort of new cultural behavior and then I show it to people around me, and let's say I show it to 4 people, they adopt it consciously or unconsciously, and then they show it to 4 people, and then you're at 16 people, and it kind of spreads from there. That also didn't quite make sense to me, knowing how fashion cycles work, in the sense that fashion spreads from a small group of elites down, and usually there's a block, in the sense that some specific look will be very popular with a group of elites, but then not spread to the wider population. So I'll take a pretty extreme example, but putting men in skirts, that has been something that has existed within the fashion world for quite a bit. It never spread to mainstream culture. That has not gone viral, and it had a block. And other things, do spread that way. But I think over time, what we've realized about the viral metaphor for culture, and it is a metaphor, it's not a mechanism, is that virality, first of all, puts the agency in the virus. It's not, when we talk about diseases, it's not that human beings are trying to give each other diseases. Viruses are working on their own behalf. And that's not the way culture works. Culture is people choosing, or at least, unconsciously adopting certain behaviors and not doing others. And then other people, having the agency to do or not do those things. And that's not how viruses work. Also, these trends tend not to spread from person to person in that pattern. And the other thing that I realized in writing this book is what usually happens when a trend starts. It starts as a very symbolically complex innovation in order to separate elites from other groups. And the only way you can get it to spread is to knock off some of that complexity, to make it more simple. And so by the time something becomes mass culture, it very rarely resembles the original innovation. And so if you think about a virus, that's not necessarily the same mechanism, which is that if I have the measles and it goes through the population, someone else still has the measles. And so in the book, I look at chocolate, for example. The chocolate starts as a beverage for the elites first in Latin America, and then in Europe, and then it only spreads once it becomes a solid form of chocolate that can be mass produced. And so to say that chocolate spread over time, it spread over time only because all of these parties intervened to make it more available to more people. But it was obviously the status value of chocolate being an elite practice to start with that made the base of the population want to also adopt it.
And I mean, coming out from the very title of the book itself, I don't want to ask was there squeamishness exactly, but the whole notion of status in our allegedly flattening age, just talking about, using terms like elite classes and such, is there any reticence or, just being careful to define what that means as far as elites go, with the assumption that your readers are going to get, what those sort of class distinctions or status distinctions mean?
Talking about status is quite difficult, and
that's what I mean. Thank you for making that much easier.
Absolutely. So, and, Tom Wolfe described it as the ultimate taboo, and I agree. I don't think it's less of a taboo. I think there's 2 or 3 problems with it. The first is, when you talk about status, a lot of people will interpret it in this 1950s Vance Packard kind of way. He had a book called The Status Seekers, and it's very much about middle-class people trying to outdo their neighbors by buying expensive things, or one-upmanship in the Cadillac size and the house and all of that. And that is a status phenomenon, but that is not the sole meaning of status. And so the sociological meaning of status is very much about what are people's positions in their group hierarchies? How does that affect their behavior? How do those dynamics work? But also in every group competes against different groups in that hierarchy for the distribution of resources. And so when you look at that broader sense, status becomes a really useful way to think about society, because when we think about society, it isn't just society. It is layered and it's hierarchical. And if you deny that there are these hierarchies, you miss a lot of what's going on. And so the first is you have to think about status. or otherwise you miss the entire story. So it's not simply just people one-upping each other, but it's also subcultures. It's also people fighting for dignity. It's the marginalization of minorities. All of these are status phenomenon. So, that's why you need to talk about it, but why people don't want to. The second is that if you talk about status, people start thinking about their own status, and then they get quite depressed because it can be a quite depressing topic. And it definitely gives you anxiety to think about your own status position. And the problem with status, as a lot of social psychology research has found recently, social psychology research has found that the more status you gain, it does not make you want less status. You actually keep demanding it. So in thinking about your status position, you will always then start feeling status anxiety because you desire more. So just bringing up the topic is anxiety inducing for a lot of people. So
I will say that. Oh, sorry. Go on. Yeah.
And then finally, when you think about status, and especially its effects on culture, you start more or less bringing a political valence into everything, because racism, sexism, the distribution of resources, these are all status problems. And once you say aesthetics have a status component, our consumer behavior has a status component, what is popular in society has a status component, you are more or less opening the door to be more political about it, and often from somewhat of a left-wing angle. And I think there's a reason that, the French theorists like Roland Barthes or Jean Baudrillard or Pierre Bourdieu are the people who are really thinking about the status implications much more than maybe American theorists. So if you live in a society where you want it to be equal, and you really hope that status isn't something that affects society, or it's a regrettable effect, you don't necessarily want to talk about status that much. And I think Americans particularly see in the past that we're not a class society, so you don't want to talk about things that way. But I feel the opposite, which is, I believe that we should fight for status equity, and that there should be a more equitable distribution of resources. And unless you understand natural status dynamics, you don't know how to overcome them. So I do believe that learning about these things is quite important if you are against status. But the idea that we're going to ignore our way into enlightenment, I think, is probably a silly idea.
Yeah, I'd wondered about the meta issue of becoming too conscious of how culture and status work, and whether that's everything in our lives is, how do we hack this and hack that? Whether there's a sense of becoming so aware of how we do this or how this promulgates that people try to, you cite examples of individuals who try to hack the status game, like Anna Delvey.
Delvey, yes.
Yeah, Delvey. Yeah. I was thinking of Clark Rockefeller when you were going through that. Do you remember the Clark Rockefeller story?
No, I'm guessing he wasn't a real Rockefeller.
No, he was not. But he married, had a kid, and once a divorce happened and he kidnapped the child and ran away, the FBI showed up and told the wife, "Your husband doesn't exist." he was this fake man. They ended up tracking him down, but yeah, German, faked sort of mid-Atlantic accent, and we actually I have a mutual friend and a novelist who knew him, who wrote a book about him, and how fooled he was the whole time. But yeah, that sense of I would say hacking culture, or whether that happens at a macro level, in addition to these one-off individuals trying to achieve status they haven't quote unquote earned.
I think that's already happening. I mean, when you think about what status is supposed to be, and Cecilia Ridgway, the professor at Stanford, has done a lot of work on what are the reasons that status hierarchies pop up within groups. And when groups are focused on a goal, certain people make more contributions than others, and there has to be a reward mechanism. And so they're treated with esteem and given more of the benefits. And from there, you get status hierarchies. And that makes a lot of sense. And then when you go to a macro social level and you look at things like fame, fame is supposed to be a result of achievement and contribution. And the way we think about celebrities, let's say 100 years ago, or the people we still remember in history books, if it's Napoleon or it's T.S. Eliot. These are people who made major contributions. And how fame works now, and this goes back to Daniel Borsten's idea of pseudo events and celebrities being famous for being famous, but that in itself is a hack. That if you can look at the end result, which is getting esteem at this macro scale, and then say, well, if I can achieve the benefit, then that shows that I have status without the contribution, then the system can be hacked. And so that it's something that I don't quite talk about in the book, but because status is always represented by these benefits, by esteem, by deference, by power, by actual material benefits from other people, if you look around you and you see individuals being treated this way, they must have high status. So it's supposed to work that you get high status because of your contributions, and then you get the benefits. But if you can gain the benefits before doing the contribution, then it hacks the whole system. And so I think inherently these systems are hackable. The entire problem with status is that we show our status through symbols, and every symbol is a lie, which is Umberto Eco's idea. And every place there could be a symbol, it could be a lie. And so because of that, it is just inherently hackable. And there have been people throughout the ages who've done so. But I think now with social media and, basically mediation itself becoming so accessible, but we're still using mediation as a measure of status, then the whole thing becomes quite confused. And you could see at some point that collapsing, that we are still attuned to see somebody on a screen and say they must be important to be on a screen. But if there's no more gatekeeping to put people on screens, you could see our brains over time readjusting and not necessarily giving people credit for that. But it is it is a hackable system. And I think providing the rules for it, again, isn't a blueprint to hack it. I think instead it's to make us more conscious of the way it's being hacked already, so that we become a little bit more critical of that. And I think in general, just the more you understand the system works, the less it works on you. The more that you understand how signaling happens, you will see it. And signals that look like signals are much less effective. And so the more that we become experts in these mechanisms and how taste works and all of that, I do think it makes us stronger and makes us more in control of the system.
I'll say when it comes to the being on screen, I mean, I do a daily short video on YouTube about this postcard a day project that I have. But the one time I was going to be on the Today Show for something in my day job about pharmaceutical manufacturing, that was a very different vibe. It turned out we recorded half an hour before the insurrection happened, so it never aired. But the amount of preparation I did and the arranging the bookshelves behind me and everything else was on a different order than the morning, let's find out what the postcard is coming out of the box. And yeah, it's meant something, I suppose. But I'll never forgive the insurrectionists just for screwing up my chance.
Well, anyway, it's the worst thing they ever did,
Yeah, of all things, it happened for me. Now, I will say, it's from everything you say, just in terms of the benefits of status, et cetera, everything in my mind flips to airlines and just who gets to board, who's elite, who's global service. It's just so nakedly there to make people who aren't of that tier feel like, I need to be up there. I need to be, this first class. Even my one trip to Japan, one of my clients flew me out business class, me and my wife, and we both said we can never come back because we can never afford business class like this, and sitting back there is just not going to work for us. So
I think about airlines quite a bit. I mean, I do think they are one of the most clear illustrations of being in status tiers, because status is an imprecise measure. There is no formal chart. And so you're in these vague tiers that people tend to understand. And an airline, they have those tiers. They're very specific. You are, platinum or executive platinum, and they come with sets of benefits as status levels do. If they don't have the benefits, then the tiers don't exist. There has to be a distinction in the level of benefits, and those benefits have to go up. At the same time, I, at the end of the book, talk about international flights, because the difference flying business class from Japan to the United States versus economy, especially on a American carrier, is night and day. And I'm particularly tall, and I can't sleep upright. And so it means being on a plane for something like 14 hours and not being able to sleep if I'm in economy. If you're in business class, to me, it's not about the Glenlivet and the steak dinner. It's just about being able to lie down. Right. And that difference, because it's so stark between economy and business, it makes you desire to be in business class. You have this aspiration for business class because the material improvement on your life is really stark. And I think about that compared to, in Japan, the high-speed rail. And the high-speed rail has more or less two classes. They have the normal class and they have green car. And the normal class is very good. The experience is great. Everything's clean. There's really no downsides to it. There's short trips, so you don't have to worry about lying down anyway. And when you go to the green car, the chairs are slightly bigger, and I think they maybe pass out wet towels to wash your hands, and maybe they serve you coffee or something. But the benefits are so minor that, yes, you can pay for this upgrade. But when you get on the train in normal class, you're not like, gosh, I really wish they would call my seat number and upgrade me. I'm just dying to one day go, be in the green car. And so, one of the problems, I think, especially in the United States, is that the basic public service that we give to people, the public resources and infrastructure that we provide is so poor that you do demand more status because you've got to get yourself out of it some way. And when you're in a country like Japan, and I think this is probably true also in Scandinavian countries, if the baseline is pretty good and what you get for the upgrade is okay, it's not bad, but it's not necessarily worth drooling over, then the status desire is much lower, and we don't feel like we've got to desperately get more status in order to move up. And so, by redistributing resources and these material benefits, you can lessen status hierarchy in the sense that you can flatten it. I don't think you can 100% get rid of hierarchies, and I don't know if that's a particularly good goal, but I think we can control what the criteria are for how these hierarchies are built, but also the difference between the levels. And so those are two ways that I think we can lessen the burdens of status in society. And, my book is very agnostic on whether status is was something that is in our DNA that evolved, that it's basically the result of evolutionary psychology. I think a lot of the work being done on this, especially among popular writers, is this idea that if you look at primates, they have dominance hierarchies, and therefore human beings have status hierarchies, and hey, they must be the same. I'd love to write a little bit more about why that's a relatively naive theory, because you can look at actual social dynamics to explain almost all parts of status hierarchies, and you don't need any evolutionary theory. But at the same time, that more or less says that human beings are destined to have these status desires and build out these status hierarchies and go to war over status, where I think it's much more subtle than that, which is that you can do things in society that lessen the anxieties that people have around status.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't want to say the frustration of the closing chapters of the book, but what you encapsulate in that period, covering what the internet era is like and how it's affected the way status and therefore culture are conveyed and promulgated. That my ongoing issue with a lot of our contemporary era is, can anything be great anymore? And I know in some of the press you've done for the book, a lot of it is about everything is good, nothing's great, glomming onto that particular area. But I've had this ongoing debate as to whether one can truly have great art in this era, whether it's, fine art, writing, et cetera, and what it is about the current times that seems to mitigate against that, which is more of a comment than a question. I apologize. No, but I figure it's something you've been riffing on for quite a while. So
it's something that I'm also been thinking about quite a bit. And it is also a topic that I think a lot of people are obsessed with at the moment. And there's a lot of concrete evidence of why it's true, in the degree to which movies are mostly reboots, that some of the most popular television shows are reruns, that I heard recently something like 20% of all the hit songs lift their melodies or their vibes from previous hits. So we are really in this moment of recycling, and it is quite boring if you know those things. And if I know the song Closing Time and didn't really love it the first time, and then somebody is referencing Closing Time in their new hit, it's going to feel disappointing. So this is something we're thinking about quite a bit. I think one of the things I talk about in the book is that our brains assign status value. So where we see some new cultural behavior or work of art associated with high status lifestyles, our brains turn that into positive values like goodness and beauty, and we don't really have much control over that. And there's a neuroscience experiment that has showed up lately where they gave people wine and they didn't tell them the price of the wine, and they said, which do you like more? And people liked the cheaper wine more. And then they told them the prices of the wine, and then they said they liked the expensive wine more, which is kind of interesting. But what was more interesting is that their brain, the activity in their brain actually changed once you told them that the wine was more expensive. And so it really did register that they were having more pleasure in drinking the wine once they knew it was expensive. And so the issue is that we cannot separate in our brains what is high status, and that's why we find it valuable, and then the intrinsic properties. And so right now, the internet does conspire against creating status value for various reasons, and that makes everything seem to be less interesting. At the same time, if you go back to Immanuel Kant's idea of what an artistic genius is, he talks about three things. He talks about originality. He talks about influence, that more or less once the artist creates innovations, those spread through society, and those are imitated and become conventional. And the third is that the way of making art is not is mysterious and not easy to replicate. And if you think of it from that angle as well, even if somebody were to create an original idea, and I think there's still a lot of original ideas out there, it is much more difficult for those ideas to go on and influence society because we are just so inundated with information, and there's so much that comes out every day, and everything is so viral that the chance of one innovation becoming the dominant paradigm of an era artistically is just much more difficult. And that's probably been true since the 1960s in the postmodern era. And so once you get past serial music, with Schoenberg and Webern and artists like that, you get to kind of a free-for-all where there's lots of different musics going on. Maybe you can say John Cage is the next stage, but then from there, you just get a lot of different things happening and no dominant narrative. And so with no dominant narrative, you can't go back and look and say, oh, this person's obviously a genius because they came up with innovations that set the whole market and set the whole institution and gave it a new set of conventions to work with. I would say someone like Quentin Tarantino probably fits that mold better, in that we definitely see Pulp Fiction as this pivotal moment in filmmaking, in that indie cinema became a much bigger part and then hybridized with mainstream cinema. And so I think that influence process, because it's messed up at the moment with the internet and just too much information spreading too quickly, and the lack of status value, it all makes it very difficult for someone to emerge as a genius. Because again, geniuses are not individuals who just rise in an individual way. Geniuses are system effects of individuals arriving in a particular context, in response to a particular set of artistic conventions, changing them, and then setting the artistic conventions for the future.
Yeah, that's like you were saying. The section on art could have stood on its own as a book. Also, I think you had plenty more to say about artists, and what it means to truly create.
Sure. I mean, you should also read Arthur Danto, or read, I got a lot of these things about aesthetic value and artistic value from Tomas Kolka, who's a Czech art historian. So yeah, I mean, I definitely, there's a lot of art theory about the institutional theory of art and those worlds that explain a lot of what I'm talking about. So it's definitely not that my ideas are fiercely original in that section, but I just try to condense it and bring it into the status system. I think one of the things that I keep hearing that's a little bit misunderstood is I most definitely do not believe that all artists create for socioeconomic status. So the artist is a high status individual in society, and you can see why people aspire to be artists. And especially misfits, if you are a misfit, one of the surefire ways for you to gain status is for your idiosyncrasies to be valued as genius innovations. So you can see why that is appealing. But I don't think that all artists are after socioeconomic status. Yeah. I simply think that, first of all artists have to get artist status, which is the institution of art has to recognize them as artists, and that creates its own struggle. And organizes the artistic process where you have to be creative in a way that responds to the art before you. The book to read on that is The Anxiety of Influence by Harold Bloom. But
one of my all-time great guests. Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. That's a big one. Yeah. But then also that the status process is what makes these idiosyncratic innovations of artists into conventions, in the sense that, Warhol only becomes Warhol as we know it as it spreads through society, as art galleries pick it up, as wealthy donors are sponsoring him, buying his work. He becomes, written about. So every step in that process is people who are glomming onto these innovations as a way to gain social status, and that ends up turning it into, convention and giving it influence. And so the status process plays a big role in the diffusion of artistic innovation, but it is not the only source.
So, it raised the question, and again, this we're leading over a lot of what you go into in depth with the role of the internet, the reduction of the need for social communication or status communication, the way you get across ideas so much quicker now, and how things proliferate. But the question of whether that equity you were discussing and creativity, true art, are really reconcilable in the don't yuck someone else's yum era that we're in. If so much of the critical apparatus is turned into, let's support the head, as you put it, the stuff, the blockbusters or the big products, and there's so little, true criticism, I guess, that impacts people's decisions. Do we get that equity at the expense of real art? I guess that's the same way of asking is art possible in this denuded age?
One thing that is just inevitable in a post-avant-garde era is that the avant-garde really did work hard to continually negate the ideas of the previous generation or previous movement, and by doing so, somewhat exhausted the possibilities. And so the obvious things that we can do with art, we've done. And so in that era, it becomes, there are fewer kind of grand narratives where you can say, art, the problem with art is that it's made by people intentionally. So we will dig into our subconsciouses to find ways to make art. Or the problem with art is that it's made by hand and it should be made by machine, or whatever it is. And so those ideas are already in circulation. It's very hard to find clear avenues of true innovation. That being said, there's still ways on a micro level to do interesting things, to surprise and delight consumers of art. I think right now, this omnivore mindset we have towards art, which is that we both want high and low, that we shouldn't discriminate against folk cultures. I think it comes from a great place. I think after Pierre Bourdieu showing that contemplative, detached aesthetics are more or less a tool for discrimination among the upper class, I think that made it very difficult to say only high art was important. The essay, The Rap Against Rockism, by Khalifa Saneh from the early 21st century, that was huge in saying, look, rock is actually conventional and stale, and it's rap and R&B where a lot of the really innovation has happened. And I think that's definitely been true in the last 20 years. So you have to look at that. And the poptimism movement that rose after that has been profound in the sense of giving us more things to appreciate at a higher level. I think it's now taken a misstep. It's not the same set of critics, but it's kind of bred a more populist side that I call ultra-optimism, which is the idea that things that are more popular and are more important because more people are interested in them and you should spend time on them. And because we're trying not to be snobs, it's often easy to say, okay, so a major artist or a major director has a new film, and we need to be nice to it because a lot of people are going to like it, and try to find what's good about it instead of just tear it down like, the bad old criticism. So, but in the end of the day, we're really looking at our monopolist artists, in a sense, for their innovation rather than innovation from the margins. And the innovations that at the margins get swept up into these powerhouse artists so quickly that in some ways they're not able to flourish on their own. So there's a lot of big system effects. A lot of them are economic and some of them are cultural, that it's just making it more difficult for those old systems to work, in that there was a group at the margins who completely and utterly rebelled against mainstream and basically devalued everything going on in the mainstream, to the degree that when they rose, there was no going back. And I think everyone is most people who come out now are happy to work with the mainstream. The revenue sources are all about working with the system as it is rather than destroying it. And so from there, the co-optation is really fast, and you don't get necessarily a big shift. And so unless people are in some ways denouncing the previous set of artists as being hackneyed or stale or whatever, that, what they used to do, you just don't get a progression. And that lack of progression is what it's making us think that everything's boring.
Yeah. So in the book, you've got a quote from Glenn O'Brien, who was somebody I wish to God I had recorded with. We'd actually corresponded about it once and didn't follow up enough, and we lost him. But something about our time makes you wish that you had lived in another time. Is there another time you'd have preferred?
I think about that question quite a bit, because obviously something like the 1960s would have been very interesting, the degree to which every year there was a new aesthetic that you could fully inhabit. And it felt like the times were changing, and it felt like there was a possibility of true revolution at many points. And so I can understand why that was exciting. I think today we're blessed with the fact that we can live in all of these different eras at the same time, that if you want to listen to jazz from the 50s and then go see a electronic concert at night, you can do all these things. You can dress in 70s huge lapel style, and the next day wear, narrow lapels from a 60s suit with a skinny tie. So, we live in great cultural diversity. It's just that by everything being equally available, everything's flat, and there really isn't a sense that this is now and it matters. So I understand the nostalgia for the 20th century, in that everything felt so vibrant and real, and that every innovation would be the last innovation. And I think we just know too well now. We have the meta-knowledge that culture changes in certain ways, that it's all kind of the same, that it doesn't matter what the lapel size is, it's all just fashion. And so it does make it painful. I think there's fun parts about it. And, in the book, I talk about the degree to which the 20th century cast a shadow over the 21st century. But one of the things that will most definitely happen is we will just simply readjust, and we will stop looking at the 20th century as the model for how culture is supposed to feel. But I think his quote is still stuck in that idea of, hey, there was something really fun about cultural progression in the way it happened in the 20th century, and it's not happening now. And I think we just have to probably abandon the idea of cultural progression, or, decamp from this idea that we're all in the same monoculture, and go back and split and maybe find something again on the margins. And so those movements are going to happen. I'm not convinced that we're that people want to bring more internet into their lives. It's quite possible that we're at peak internet taking over. There was a great...
We always say that.
Yeah, we always do
Sorry,
that. I saw a great viral video yesterday of a guy, and it's like me being a millennial journalist, and it's him just like really excitedly writing all these clickbait headlines and tweets. And then by the end of it, he's just in tears because it's so much and it's relentless. And I watched it, I just thought, like, we know this is terrible. Like, we know this is not what culture should be. And we're the economics of it are such that we're powerless to stop it. But you can see people tuning out. And I mean, even on Instagram, I feel that there was a time pre-pandemic where it was peak Instagram, everybody doing stories all the time and updating what's going on with their lives. And it really has ebbed, and that some people still do that, but not everyone. There's people you don't see from at all anymore. But there's a good possibility that offline IRL culture, it becomes ascendant again in a certain sense. I mean, it never will be what it was in the 20th century, but I could see more fragmentation between offline and online coming. And so that may be some sort of remedy. But anyway, I guess what I would say in general is I don't think we're going to spend the 21st century moping about it not being as nice as the 20th century. I think we'll find some ways to change the direction we're in so that things feel more interesting.
I did mention my postcard a day thing earlier. It literally is mailing out a postcard to someone every day. And it's sometimes, they might live close enough that they get it in a few days. Sometimes the guest or the recipient will be in Japan, and we correspond every week or two, depending on when they write back. And it's just oh yeah, that's how we used to do things. They could be slow. We could wait to hear back from somebody. And it's a nice change of pace. It's not the only way to communicate, of course. Some people email me to tell me they got the postcard, which sort of defeats the purpose. But, that's still, I guess some vain attempt at this. But I mean, it also raises that question, which you get to near the end. Are we in an extraordinarily static era, or are we coming out of an extraordinarily dynamic one? One that, as you mentioned, especially from the 60s, generated huge amounts of cultural change that nothing was going to measure up to anyway. Or, are we in particular a drought, I guess, when it comes to the effect of technology and this constant retromania and neomania that you bring up? I
mean, the change in art from the 1880s to the 1960s must be the most dynamic change in aesthetics ever in human history. And so to live after that and live the after effects, and you could, explain a lot of 20th century musical changes also as maybe trickle down from those, just the whole avant-garde mindset. Certainly with techno, that started from a incredibly avant-garde mindset. The rise of subcultures was also something I think that avant-garde mindset made possible. So that was an incredibly fertile period of human creativity, and it's not possible to sustain forever. And I think we have hit a wall. But it's, we've lived through stable eras before. I think culture probably does move in a punctuated equilibrium in the sense that you have moments of great creativity and change and dynamic periods, and then you have long periods of staticness. I mean, I think what we're confused about is we're not in a conservative static period where everyone is sticking to convention. There is a lot of experimentation and a lot of attempts at change. It's just those changes don't stick. And that's something that, Leonard B. Meyer, the music critic, identified in the 1960s as already happening, which is that there's a lot going on, but it feels static because none of them are setting the narrative changes. So we're in that era, and we got to deal with it and probably readjust. And it's impossible to predict when the next layer of creativity comes. But on a personal, individual level, if you want to hear something new every day that changes and bends the conventions in your mind about how to appreciate art, there is a lot out there. It's just harder to believe that society is going through all those changes at the same time.
Are you concerned that your book itself might become a status symbol in Hollywood or other creative circles? Because seeing the Hollywood Reporter write about this book was one of those, really? Okay, that's kind of interesting.
I agree, that was interesting. I'm not concerned.
A surface. Go on. Yeah, sorry.
I mean, the book is written in an accessible way. It is not a brief history of time where people buy it just to show off. I think you could actually read it and take a lot from it. People may complain they even know too much about it, and it simply organizes things they already know. So I don't worry that it's going to be bought and not read. But I also think this knowledge is empowering, and I don't mean that in a self-serving way. I just simply mean I believe everyone should know these things. And, we don't have a discipline that makes it automatic that you learn these principles of social behavior. So, for example, I think people are exposed to the idea of human evolution, that we, over time, took on these certain traits in evolution. I think we have economics as a field that talks about what do humans do rationally in order to maximize the resources that they have and use money to get as much benefit as possible. There's all these fields. I think the field of non-rational human behavior, I don't mean irrational. I mean, maybe irrational behavior, you have the whole field of psychology to look at that. But this non-rational behavior of convention forming and how certain behaviors and objects that are arbitrarily valued, how they take on value in social arrangements, is one of the biggest parts of human life. And yet there really is not a field in which you learn this. Maybe it's anthropology, but anthropology tends to really focus on its particular methods or what it means about humankind. But a book like Convention by David Lewis, the philosopher, maybe you read if you're doing a philosophy of language, but probably at a pretty deep level. But most normal people are not exposed to this. Social hierarchy is everywhere. It's in high schools, but we don't teach high school students that it exists or what it is or why these social dynamics work. I think there's a reason for it, because the more you learn about the non-rationality of human behavior and language, and you learn that it's arbitrary and that it's contingent, it really undermines all of the metaphysical values that we try to instill in people. And so there is a very big conflict between understanding the contingency of human beliefs and then trying to inculcate students with them. And so I understand why we don't necessarily teach these things, but what I would love is just for this material to be accessible, whether it's through my book or through other books or through the resurfacing of books that I reference, that this knowledge is available to everybody and everybody has absorbed it. And we create a new human civilization with much better grasp on how these social dynamics work, because that is the only way to get out of our natural inclinations to do certain things that tend to be exclusionary or tend to make things like conventional art. And so if we're able to understand how convention works in order to avoid the replication of convention, which tends to get very boring, then that's great. If we can find new ways to judge culture on something other than, its elite status and more about its specific complexity, I think that could be a way to revive the kind of criticism we used to have instead of just focusing on what's popular and what's good about it. So there are a lot of things we can learn about the way culture and status works that benefit us. And if the book is a status symbol in the sense that many people buy it and it influences other people to buy it and they read it, that is wonderful. If there is a huge backlash against the book, again, we have to talk about status and culture, and everyone says this is wrong, but this is what the true story of status and culture is, and it's more accurate than my book. That's fantastic too. So I do not worry about anything other than people not talking about status and culture, because I think it's just until now, these are two things that are misunderstood and not well understood, and that we as a society, because it's so foundational to every individual lived experiences, but also the way we understand history and we understand the narrative in which we live, that if we don't deal with this, we come up with lots of bogus explanations that end up not explaining much.
Now, one of the things I'm curious about, again, I focus on those last couple of chapters just because they're the ones I went into the book, most concerned about. Early in the book, you go into sort of the old money set and the nouveau riche and a couple of other status groups and how they demonstrate status and how it again, kind of trickles down from the highest level of cultural elite, at least in terms of what the signals mean and how they can afford certain things. And with the internet era, you sort of show how it's nouveau riche, with the Gucci wrapped Lamborghini or something.
Louis Vuitton Supreme
that's right.
wrapped Ferrari. Yes,
that's it. And that sort of conspicuous consumption and baller lifestyle. What becomes of that old money set as the internet era and the new nouveau riche achieve prominence and other other modes and models proliferate? Is that diluted? Is it a turning within? Is there, not that I'm worried about what becomes of old money. I'm just curious as to, where they go, I suppose.
I mean, old money all started as new money at some point. There's
Sure.
not an inevitability of old money. There are certain systems such as feudalism in which you have a permanent aristocracy that becomes old money over time. But even that, is overturned as the bourgeoisie starts becoming more rich than old money, starts buying themselves titles, and then the whole system collapses. So, we're not necessarily destined as a human society to always have this class of old money. It's just existed in the past, and they have been seen as the highest status group in many societies because they are reliably wealthy in the sense that that their children will also be wealthy, whereas new money can be a flash in the pan. And so this group generally had dominated cultural standards for a long time in places like the UK and the US, and France, Japan to a certain extent. And right now we live in an era of new money for a couple of reasons. And first is just these tech fortunes or these big fortunes made in on the market in IPOing companies. You can have a company like Uber, which doesn't make very much money, and yet the founders go off to make billions. So these kind of fortunes dwarf old money trusts. And so the idea that old money are truly wealthy, I think, is the first problem, is that, these people's wealth has been completely devalued compared to the giant fortunes that the billionaires have. So that's one thing. I think also you have a culture focused on social media in which the wealthy new money from around the world, and these are often places that are lacking in the cultural capital founded, and established in the West, and these ideas of detachment and modesty. So these cultures tend to be much more brash, get more attention. When, there's a Saudi Arabian prince who brings his fleet of 10 golden cars to London, that becomes news. So, if that is what people are looking at as, oh, this is what wealthy people do, then, new money starts to take over the mind share of our understanding of wealth. And so that is the moment, and old money just loses out. I think subtlety and detachment only work as signals when you're in a small community where people already know who you are, when you're signaling only to other people in old money. It doesn't work on a huge platform where you have quantifiable status and the number of followers you have and the number of views you get. So all of that, it just makes it very difficult for old money to flourish with its own aesthetics. I think there's some fetishism of old money style, especially in men's fashion. It's, my first book was about men's fashion, so I know that world pretty well. And a lot of the style tips you see of what is good taste are just more or less old money principles. And then on TikTok, there's an old money hashtag. I think it's, literally hashtag old money that does not understand at all what old money aesthetics are. So when you read a book like Nelson Aldrich Jr.'s Old Money, which is a fantastic, authoritative text on what it meant to be old money in the mid 20th century in America, none of those aesthetic principles really carry over to our internet age. And that's not necessarily, it could change. You could have an old money of all these tech billionaires if there's no more IPOs in the future. We could be in a robber baron era, and then it settles down into a bunch of old money families based off tech wealth. That could happen. But at the current moment, we're certainly in a new money celebrity bling era.
Yeah. So what brought you to Japan? And I promise only one or two questions left, but I did want to get an idea because I think you mentioned growing up in Mississippi.
I grew up I was born in Oklahoma, moved to Mississippi for a bit, and then mostly grew up in Pensacola, Florida, which is the very Alabama part of Florida. It's about 20 minutes from the border of Alabama. And,
so you've answered the question of what got you out of
the
country to Japan.
Why not Tokyo? Compared to Pensacola, Tokyo is definitely a step up. But Pensacola had a sister city connection with a Japanese small town. And through that connection, I got to go to Japan in high school and loved my experience, ended up studying Japanese and Japanese society, did 2 work internships that paid my way to come to Japan in college and discovered Tokyo street culture and fell in love and really wanted to study kind of what was going on there and came back to get a master's and stayed. So it first came from real kind of an intellectual interest and a cultural interest, so both on the personal and the academic levels. And now, Tokyo in particular, I don't know what people's image of it is, but it must be the place with the best cost-performance ratio of any city in the world. I mean, it is, especially with the yen being so weak right now, it's just an unbelievable bargain for the quality you get. But it is somewhere that feels like society has not collapsed. And the public transport is incredible. Obviously there are rich people and poor people, but you do not feel the struggle. It's hidden a bit. I spend a lot of time writing to make sure people are aware of those differences, but they're not overwhelming. And the society in general works, and people are given dignity for the work that they do, whether it's construction jobs or it's elite, salaried employees. And so it's a culture that redistributes its resources pretty well to the public and redistributes respect relatively well. And it's nice to live here. I mean, it really is. I think I speak Japanese and read Japanese, so that barrier is also eliminated, but it is also massively globalized in the last 10, 15 years. I think that the exclusion that used to happen to people who are not born in Japan certainly still exists. I don't want to deny it, but it is much less than it used to be. And it's the whole social system is a little bit more up in the air, to the degree that it's just accepting that people are coming here from other places. I don't think Japan globalized itself. It was globalized. But even the fact that immigration is increasing, and most definitely living here, in the last 20 years, I've seen a huge difference in the number of foreign residents. And when I say foreign, I do not mean Western. I mean mostly people from China, Taiwan, Vietnam, Thailand, Indonesia, but, young women in hijabs, walking around the park or something like that. You just see a massive increase in that. And if you go to your convenience store, it's likely that you don't see Japanese people working behind the desk, which is a big change. So all of that is happening, and yet there's not a big societal freakout around immigration. And you don't see society cleaving the way you do in other places. And so it is a relatively stable place to live at the moment. And you hear lots of doomsday about the economy. And yes, the economy is not growing, but it's not on the brink of collapse.
I've got a presentation in 2 months to give to a Japanese healthcare consortium that'll be meeting here in New Jersey. So I'm hoping to impress them enough that they decide to bring me and my wife back over sometime soon, because it really was, beyond being the last trip we took before the pandemic shut everything down. It was a wonderful week to spend there.
I mean, Japan also is, it's one of the best tourist destinations in that, I mean, it really helps right now that it's inexpensive, but you get a very foreign experience if you're not from Japan. Everything is very Japanese. Even the versions of Italian or French cuisine, the whole presentation and all of that is so precise and Japanese. Without the danger of going to somewhere where you really worry about, am I going to get lost? Am I not going to be able to get home again? And people still leave their wallets on trains, and the wallets show up in police stations, and you get a call to go pick it up. So it is the mix of safety and foreignness is still quite great for travelers.
Certainly the one time I was in China, Shanghai, and realized that I was not going to be able to convey to the cab driver at all where my hotel was until I finally remembered to give him like the key card of the hotel he could read and figure out where to go. But until then, I was pretty much sure I was headed to my death because there was just no form of communication whatsoever to figure out where we were going. But
I mean, obviously, that's also exciting. That's not to say you never want to go somewhere where there's not a sense of danger, but I think Japan just delivers such a great experience as a tourist.
Yeah. Cool. Last question. Who are you reading? And I know I should have told you beforehand because nobody likes to get caught, unprepared for that one. But who have you been reading?
I read a lot of books at the same time, which is a kind of dirty habit. And it's gotten particularly bad this year. I think when I was writing the book, I had to read a lot of books for the book. And so I was constantly just going through this pile of, I've got to get to Thomas Frank, and now I've got to get to Immanuel Kant, or whoever was in that list. So now I'm taking a slight break and trying to read a couple of things that I hadn't. I just read Virginia Postrel's The Substance of Style, which is about kind of the rise of aesthetics in the early 20th century, which I quite enjoyed.
One of my favorite guests. Yeah, she was good.
I really want to read her new book as well. I haven't quite gotten it yet.
It's really, we've recorded a remote one for that. We did it in person for her book on glamour, but the textile one we did remotely last year. Everything's a blur, that. Yeah. Anyway, sorry. Go on.
Yeah, I'm reading Richard Rorty's Contingency, Irony, and Solidarity, which I'm finding great. I think it's almost the perfect book to read after you've written a dissection of people's social values, because it is all about the moral dilemma of being someone who understands that beliefs are all contingent and not in rejecting all metaphysics, and what that means. And can you still be a liberal? Can you still connect to liberalism and solidarity, even though you believe everything is contingent? And I think he's trying to build what he calls being a liberal ironist, which I quite like. So I think that has struck home, and I think kind of probably gets to the closest philosophical disposition that I have. Also reading, the Guns of August by Barbara Tuchman. That's just the classic World War I book. And Symbolic Exchange and Death by Jean Baudrillard, which is, I think, his first four books or five books are, I guess this was maybe his fifth, but the first four are pretty straightforward, and they kind of go push towards one narrative. I think Symbolic Exchange and Death is maybe the most radical and quite difficult in parts. But yeah, I read too many things at the same time, and I've got just stacks waiting for me. I think that stresses me out in one way, but it also kind of encourages me to get through things. And I always have to finish books. I do not like abandoning them in the middle. And that is often because, especially with fiction, you get to some sort of slog at the 75% mark, but then the last 10% will always be incredible, and it will make the whole thing worth it. And so I just have this faith that if I just keep pushing through, it will be good in the end. And I think that's true for most things. So
usually is, yeah. And I get to throw out the Against the Day by Thomas Pynchon was my big one for this year. In addition to all the podcast reading, I found 1,084 pages. If I read 15 pages a night, and realized 3 months later what that was really going to mean. But it's one of those fictional worlds that you might be afraid around the 300, 400, 500 page mark that this isn't going to pay off. You stick with it, and even 800 pages in, it's like there's no way this all comes together.
Right.
It all comes together, but it's one of those things where, again, we talk about great art versus less ambiguous sets of complex symbols, I suppose.
Yeah. I'm also I'm reading Douglas Hofstadter's Gödel, Escher, Bach, which is, that one's also about 870 pages or something like that. And I'm at the 400 something mark, and, maybe I'm more than half done. And it's broken up into small sections so you can kind of pick it up, and it's not particularly progressive in argument in the sense that, he kind of flips back and forth and you can figure out where you are. But, the experience of reading a long book like that is an experience, and it requires a lot of patience, but sometimes it doesn't pay off, and then it is quite frustrating. And I do think even having written a 300-page book when I read a 100-page book, I'm like, a 100-page book is great because you just get in and get out. Yeah. And so I'm, the book I'm thinking about next is definitely something more around 100 pages and 300 pages before I do another, normal size book. So there's something really, when you see these huge books, they become fetishized in their own size. And I think that's interesting, but it really is a burden on the author to make it pay off. And we also live in such a world of distraction where it has to be an incredible act of discipline by the reader to really push through.
Sure. That's, again, we have to be somewhat anomalous as the average reader goes. But anyway, I'm glad to get all those items from you, because one of the great things about the podcast is how many new books it turns me on to. So, I'll be sure to plunder your reading list at some point. And I will ask about your next book off mic, because I hate jinxing authors by asking them about that next project you alluded to.
I was just told never tell people what your next project is. But unfortunately, I read a lot of old books. But the thing is, there's so many old books that are great that have been either forgotten or people just know from their one-line summary. I mean, even something like Thorstein Veblen's The Theory of the Leisure Class. It is known mostly just for conspicuous consumption, but that's one chapter in the book, and there's a lot of subtle nuance that he has. He has many ideas that are not summarizable just by saying conspicuous consumption. So everything in the past also can be repicked up, and there's lots of insights in there already. And I do feel like it's our mission sometimes to revive the ideas of those books rather than just, finding whatever's new.
Understood. That's a great note for us to leave off on, David. Thanks so much for coming on the show. And, status symbol or not, I will carry around this book and try and foist it off on a few friends of mine.
Thank you so much for having me, and it was an excellent conversation.
And that was W. David Marx. His new book, Status and Culture, really is an eye-opener, and I hope you guys give it a read. Came out last month, which is September 2022 for you time travelers out there, from Viking in the U.S. And it really gives a non-jargony approach to understanding how culture, taste, and fashion work, and how they change over time, and why status and social rank really is a key to it all. Now, David's on Twitter and Instagram as W. David Marx, all one word, WDavidMarx. His website is neomarxism.com, neomarxisme.com. But you should definitely sign up for his newsletter, which is culture.ghost.io. And I'll have links to all of that in the show and episode notes for this one. Now, you can support the Virtual Memories Show by telling other people about it. Let them know there's this podcast coming out every week with really interesting conversations with really fascinating people. By every week, I mean, except for next week. And you can also help out the show by telling me what you like and don't like about it. Tell me who you think I should record with, what movie or TV show or book or music or piece of theater or art exhibition, whatever you think I should turn listeners on to. You can do that by sending me a postcard. I love postcards, or a letter, or an email. Or you can call my Google Voice number, which is 973-869-9659. That goes directly to voicemail, so you don't have to worry about me picking up and getting stuck in an awkward conversation with me. And messages can be up to 3 minutes long. So if you're going to go longer than that, you get cut off. You'll have to call back and leave a second message. If you have something interesting to say, let me know if it'd be cool to include it in an upcoming episode of the show. I would never do that without the speaker's approval, but you might have something that would be a really interesting thing for our listeners to hear. Now, if you've got money to spare, don't give it to me. I mean, it's nice to get that sort of tribute from people, but my day job treats me fine and my expenses are pretty minimal. So really, if you've got sort of resources to spare, then I hope you'll give it to individuals or institutions in need. You can find people through GoFundMe, Patreon, Kickstarter, Topato.go, Crowdfunder, and other crowdfunding platforms. There are people who need help with medical bills or rent or veterinary bills or help getting an artwork off the ground or education or training or something. So you can make a difference in someone's life by doing that sort of thing. Now, when it comes to institutions or foundations, I give to my local food bank. I give sometimes to the Poor People's Campaign. I make targeted election contributions, but I'm a registered lobbyist, so that's sort of tied into my day job, or at least the function of my day job. But there are other things you can contribute to also. Freedom funds, other election funds, Planned Parenthood, women's choice and abortion funds. There are a lot of things you can do to help us work towards a better world. So, I hope you will. Our music for this episode is Fella by Hal Mayforth, used with permission from the artist. You should visit my archives to check out my episode with Hal from the summer of 2018 and learn more about his art and painting. And you can listen to his music at soundcloud.com/Mayforth. And that's MAY4TH. And that's it for this week's episode of the Virtual Memories Show. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back next week with another great conversation. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show and download past episodes at the iTunes Store. You can also find all our episodes and get on our email list at either of our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/VM. You can also follow the Virtual Memories Show on Twitter and Instagram at vmspod, at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com, and on YouTube, Spotify, and TuneIn.com by searching for Virtual Memories Show. And if you like this podcast, please tell your pals, talk it up on social media, and go to iTunes, look up the Virtual Memories Show, and leave a rating and maybe a review for us. It all goes to helping us build a bigger audience. You've been listening to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth. Keep reading, keep making art, and keep the conversation going.